Good morning and welcome to MITRE. Thank you for joining us for this important panel, Taiwan Dynamics in this Decisive Decade, co-hosted by the Center for Strategic Competition and the Counter-PRC cell within MITRE's National Security Sector, MNS. We are happy to be joined by GMF's Indo-Pacific Program Director, Bonnie Glaser, and retired Rear Admiral and MITRE's National Security Fellow, Mike Studeman, as expert contributors to this conversation. Please note that the event is being recorded and will be posted on our website. Additionally, please mute all cellular devices. For the past 4 years, the Center for Strategic Competition has invited speakers to MITRE to explore subjects related to global strategic competition, with topics ranging from national security to economic statecraft to space, demographics, climate, and health. Last year, MNS's Counter-PRC cell was established to provide our intelligence community sponsor support in countering the evolving PRC threat. The cell offers thought leadership, technical solutions, and cross-IC connections to ensure our sponsors have the tools they need to grapple with the demands encountered in the China mission space. My name is Asha Clark, and I currently serve as MITRE's lead all-source intelligence analyst for China and Taiwan. Joining in February of this year, I am new to the company, but I am not new to China and Taiwan issues. I have over 15 years of Chinese language and culture experience, am fluent in Mandarin, and most recently served as the China subject matter expert at NATO ACT. In my role here at MITRE, I bring a strong cultural and political understanding of the People's Republic of China, and I am happy to be opening our event today. Before we dive into our important discussion, I want to take a moment to level set our strategic understanding of the so-called Taiwan issue for this conversation. The purpose of our panel today is to talk about China, of course, but it is more importantly to highlight the green side, or our allies. So often do we focus on China as an actor and the military actions of the People's Liberation Army without deeply considering the net effect that the CCP's actions towards unification has on the island itself. This panel seeks to shed more light on the significant aspect. Ms. Glaser and Radam Studeman offer important perspectives in this regard, particularly within the context of yesterday's inauguration of DPP President William Lai. Taiwan faces much unpredictability in 2024. Whether that's an unpredictable November US election and its potential implications, an unpredictable and complex domestic political environment, the unpredictability of strategic miscalculation as the PRC ramps up its gray zone coercion in and around the island, the unpredictability of timing, or what a full-scale future conflict may or may not look like with China. Will it be a quarantine, an invasion, a blockade, a slow drip of gray zone pressure? Taiwan faces these questions daily and must prepare its diplomatic, information, military, and economic environments for a wide scope of potential courses of action by the CCP. This becomes especially important as the Chinese government seeks daily to create new norms around the disputed island. Now, I would like to introduce our moderator for today's discussion. Margaret Stremecki leads the Counter-PRC cell in MITRE's National Security Sector. As lead, Ms. Stremecki manages internal projects related to the challenges posed by the strategic competition with the PRC, serves as a focal point for MNS on issues related to the PRC, and conducts outreach to sponsors working in the PRC mission space. Margaret has been at MITRE for 4 years, following a long career at CIA, where she was a senior executive and the director of analysis in 2 mission centers. Before we begin, we ask that you please reserve your questions for the end of the panel, as there will be a follow-on Q&A session. We will take both virtual and in-person questions. Thank you, and please enjoy the discussion.
Thank you, Asha. Good morning and welcome, everyone. Today, I am pleased to welcome 2 exceptional thought leaders on the critical issues surrounding Taiwan and the PRC. First, let me welcome Bonnie Glaser. Bonnie is Managing Director of the German Marshall Fund's Indo-Pacific Program. She is also a non-resident fellow with the Lowy Institute in Sydney, Australia, and a senior associate with the Pacific Forum. She is a co-author of the book U.S.-Taiwan Relations, Will China's Challenge Lead to a Crisis?, published by Brookings Press in April of 2023. And she was previously Senior Advisor for Asia and the Director of the China Power Project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Bonnie has worked at the intersection of Asia-Pacific geopolitics and U.S. policy for more than 3 decades. I'm also pleased to include on our panel today Mike Studeman, who is MITRE's first National Security Fellow. Mike Studeman is a recently retired 2-star admiral who was formerly the commander of the Office of Naval Intelligence, the Director for Intelligence, the J2, for 2 combatant commands, Indo-PACOM and SOUTHCOM, and the commanding officer of the Joint Intelligence Operations Center at U.S. Cybercom. Mike spent 35 years in the military in a wide variety of Navy and joint assignments, many of them in the Pacific, is an honors graduate in Mandarin Chinese, a former White House Fellow, and author of a forthcoming book on leadership called Might of the Chain, Forging Leaders of Iron Integrity. So welcome to Mike and Bonnie. I'm going to start opening up our conversation, talking about the inauguration of William Lai yesterday, which was a seminal event in Taiwanese history. So William Lai was inaugurated yesterday as the new president of Taiwan and the 3rd president from the Democratic People's Party. Beijing had a rocky relationship with Lai's predecessor and conducted an active communications campaign to prevent Lai's election because of the DPP's more assertive stance on Taiwanese independence. Starting with Bonnie, with your depth of understanding on Taiwanese politics, can you provide us with details on Lai's background, as well as his key priorities and the composition of his presidential team? And as you observed his inaugural speech yesterday, can you please touch on any elements in his inaugural speech that you found noteworthy?
Well, thank you so much for having me today. It really was an important event to have the inauguration of William Lai at a very difficult time and contentious relationship that Taiwan has with China, and Taiwan's growing relationship with the United States and the international community. This incoming president will face a lot of challenges. But Lai Ching-te, or William Lai, has been preparing for this job for a long time. He is a politician, but he started out actually when he was born in a relatively poor family. His father was a coal miner, and just a few months after he was born, his father died in a coal mining accident. He was the 6th child, and his mother raised all of the children alone. And so he went into university and was studying medicine to become a doctor, which I think thrilled his mother, a very prestigious future and career for her son. He went off to Harvard, got a master's there, came back. He was a chief resident at one of the leading hospitals. And then after 1996, which many of you probably know, the Taiwan Strait crisis in 95, 96, he decided to go into politics. And his mother was very much against that decision, but he stuck with it. And he was in the National Assembly and then became a legislator in Tainan, which is the southern part of Taiwan, where you have mostly people who speak Hokkien or Taiwanese and people who support Taiwan independence. And he has for a long time, as a local politician, supported a change in the name of Taiwan, the name of the country, as well as a new constitution. But when he left the local position, he was called up to be a premier by President Tsai Ing-wen. He basically modified his position and said, we are already an independent sovereign state. Taiwan does not need to declare that it is. And so I believe that over the last 4 years, he's had a gradual transition to becoming a national leader from being a local leader and understanding the responsibilities that come with being president of Taiwan. His team, his national security team, is essentially composed of people who were in senior positions in Tsai Ing-wen's administration. So we know that the Secretary General of the National Security Council will go over to the military and be the defense minister. He is a civilian. He is being charged with implementing defense reforms, and this will be a very challenging task for him. He is actually the third civilian defense minister. I think the first one lasted about 3 or 4 months, and the second one about 3 or 4 days. So I'm sure he's going to last longer. Wellington Gu is his name, and he has a very good relationship, I think, with President Lai. And then, of course, there's the vice president herself, who's been the representative here. Her English name, she goes by Bi-Kim Xiao. It was interesting to listen to the inauguration yesterday. They used her Chinese name, and then in the English version, they used her. What she prefers is the Taiwanese pronunciation of her name. And she has a very deep background in international affairs. But the president himself does not. He does not come from a similar background. Tsai Ing-wen she'd been head of the Mainland Affairs Council. She was the negotiator when Taiwan entered the WTO, the World Trade Organization. So she has a very strong background in international issues, really both trade and understanding China. So Lai will have to rely more on his people. The foreign minister is moving over to be head of the National Security Council, and there will be a new foreign minister who was previously working in the president's office for President Tsai. So I see this as sort of musical chairs. The premier is new, which is Zhou Rongtai, which is really essential because there's a lot of dissatisfaction within Taiwan, especially among the youth, about stagnant wages and rising housing costs and things of that nature. So the premier is in charge of these domestic issues. So just say a couple of words about the inaugural speech and things that struck me. One was William Lai's emphasis on Taiwan's expanding role in the world as a global beacon of democracy. He said Taiwan should become the MVP of the democratic world. He wants to build on Tsai Ing-wen's legacy of strengthening ties with so many countries around the world. He stated he would preserve the status quo. He called on China to cease its political and military intimidation against Taiwan and engage in dialogue with the legal government chosen by the people of Taiwan, which is a good message and one that has been delivered by the prior president. But he also issued what I would call some goodwill. It stated that both sides of the strait should exchange tourists and that Taiwan would be willing to take more students from China to go to university in Taiwan. One of the most notable things to me about the speech was his emphasis on the need for cross-party political coordination in the legislature. And I think this is one of the biggest challenges that Lai faces, which we all have to understand, is that the DPP has had a majority in their legislature for the last 8 years under President Tsai, and that is gone. So the KMT, one of the opposition parties, has one more seat than the DPP, but it can work together with the Taiwan People's Party and forge a coalition. And we just saw last week a major brawl, which is not uncommon in Taiwan's legislature, where I believe 5 people ended up in the ICU. So you have to learn to challenge, to express your views through language, words, not through fists. And this is something that I think Taiwan struggles with. But he will not be able to get his agenda through the legislature easily. And so reaching across the aisle is going to be, I think, very important for him. And then finally, he really laid out a vision for Taiwan, economically, socially, things he wants to achieve. So he's ambitious. He comes to this role, I think, understanding a great deal of the domestic challenges that Taiwan faces. But I think it's a learning process, and I'm sure he's gotten excellent briefings from our intelligence officials about the threats that he faces from China, which he's come to understand, I think, to a large extent as vice president, but now is in the seat where he will be making decisions about how to respond to them.
Thank you, Bonnie. That was an excellent laydown of the political picture, and Lai has his work cut out for him for sure. Can you pull up a few of the threads on the independent stance of the Democratic People's Party and why that is something that creates neuralgia in Beijing?
Well, I think the brief answer to that is that Beijing considers Taiwan part of China, has always claimed sovereignty over Taiwan. PRC has never ruled Taiwan, and Taiwan was part of China for a very short time during the Qing dynasty. China has a lot of legal warfare that it uses to try to explain why Taiwan is part of China. The Potsdam Treaty, the Cairo Declaration. Taiwan was actually taken, the sovereignty of Taiwan was taken from Japan, but not given to China. And so that's where we, the United States, disagree with China. And China has not had the military capability, of course, to take Taiwan. Has some capability to destroy it, I suppose, but not to take it. And this is, I think, one of the reasons which I'm sure Mike will talk at length about as to why we are far more concerned today, because we have an ambitious leader who has said at the 19th Party Congress in 2017 that reunification is essential for achieving national rejuvenation, the target date for which is 2049.
That's President Xi.
That's Xi Jinping. He is the first leader to actually set a target date for national rejuvenation, though not the first to link together reunification with national rejuvenation. And so the combination of ambition, potential intent, and capabilities, I think, is really what has us, many people, quite nervous. And I should say Lai Ching-te comes from, or William Lai comes from a faction in the DPP, which we consider to be the Deep Greens, the more pro-independence factions. There are others, but I believe his own view is to preserve the status quo. What I'm concerned about is if China is very harsh on him, puts more and more pressure on him, as they ratchet up that pressure, we don't know how he will respond. They will test him as a new leader. They always test new leaders, including ours.
Yes. Okay, thank you. Wonderful. Mike, let's turn to you to talk a little bit about Beijing, or a little bit further, exploring that topic area.
First of all, I want to say, isn't it great to have somebody like Bonnie up here that can actually go to any layer that you want to talk about at depth and breadth with a very key partner. I would comment that I think one of the weaknesses within our national security community is that we don't pull up these experts often enough to really educate the American people and even the decision makers that are in the White House or Congress. And so we need to tap this kind of expertise. It may be rare, particularly in the Indo-Pacific, but it has to be pulled up because Bonnie spent most of her life kind of studying this, knows these people personally, and we need to listen to somebody who is a true expert to bring the realism, the understanding that we'll need to make really smart choices for a very key area in the world. And so we've got to avoid this idea that, and we tend to do this with the China problem, that this is an America versus China issue of strategic competition, when in fact this is about what the world should look like, what the international community should be doing with one another, what rules you abide by, how does that actually protect people, make them feel safe, allow commerce to thrive. These are the central questions. And so every country, every government, every democracy, every non-democracy matters. And so we need to understand these things better and connect with people that actually know what they're talking about, right? So anyway, props to Bonnie, and thanks for coming today. And so China has a strategy of trying to intimidate, harass, exhaust the Taiwan military, and affect the morale of a people that isn't yet cooperating the way that Beijing wants them to move towards sort of these political aims that Xi Jinping has set out. So that's still in place. And in fact, we are seeing new modifications. People are asking about whether or not we've established a new norm yet post Pelosi's visit. And I still believe that the Chinese are looking for more and more combinations of ways to be able to rattle the Taiwanese side, to be able to have them continue to sort of pay a price for not fully cooperating there. So that is ongoing every single day, and we're seeing new manifestations of that in terms of tactics and procedures. Some of it's around the main island of Taiwan. Some of it has gotten some press with regard to the offshore islands, which we can talk about in more detail. Like,
sure. Thank you very much. Bonnie, turning to you on the political front, what was PRC's official rhetorical response to Lai's inauguration, and how did it compare to Beijing's reaction to Tsai's inauguration, his predecessor?
This is a really important question because when President Tsai was elected, she had had secret channel talks through many channels with Beijing. Some of them, I think, were more with the research institute, some with business leaders. And she believed that if she said certain things, crafted certain language, that she would be able to preserve some kind of communication channels with Beijing that would be official or semi-official. And that did not come to pass. But in her inaugural speech, she did make some statements that were intended to achieve that objective. So she talked about the talks that took place between the representatives of Taiwan's government in 1992, then a KMT government, with the Chinese Communist Party. And this, of course, led to the 1992 consensus, a word that was attached to it many years later, basically an understanding the two parts of the strait are the same country, but we will call them by different names. That's something a position the DPP has never accepted. And so she went, I would say, more than halfway in her speech and at the time in 2016 and said, our representatives of our governments met in 1992 and achieved something without calling it the consensus. And Beijing gave her nothing. What they did was they said, this is an unfinished exam paper. Basically, if you don't say 1992 consensus, it's not good enough. So the bar was set very high. That was unfortunate. I think probably there are people in Beijing who look back on this period and feel maybe it could have been handled differently. She was a potentially pragmatic partner, really, that could have, I think, adopted some policies that could have prevented what we have seen over the last 8 years in the increase in tensions and particularly, of course, military buildup by the PRC. But that's water under the bridge. We now have Lai come, and the Chinese readout of the Taiwan Affairs Office, also their foreign minister plus leading diplomat, Wang Yi, who sits on the Politburo, also made a lengthy statement. And I would essentially characterize it this way. They repeated language. They've said before that the situation in the Taiwan Strait is complex and severe. The root cause is the DPP's stubborn insistence on Taiwan independence. So, of course, no blame on the PRC side. It's all the DPP's fault. They charge the DPP with colluding with external forces to continuously pursue independence, including separatism and cross-strait confrontation. This is about us, of course, the United States. And this has become a more prominent part of Beijing's message over the last year. The threat is not only, from their perspective, independence, it is the outside world and the United States bolstering Taiwan's ability to defend itself, is what we would say. They would say embolden Taiwan to pursue independence. And then one last statement I want to quote is Taiwan independence and peace across the strait are incompatible. So in 2016, there were 22 words in the Taiwan Affairs Office statement. This was really quite robust, but it reflects a judgment that Beijing it really reached long before Lai Ching-te was elected and before he gave his inauguration speech. They see him as a diehard pro-independence separatist. And so they reached that conclusion. It almost may not have mattered too much what he said. And I have heard actually people in Lai's circle say that that is his view. It didn't matter what he would say or not say because they've already reached a judgment of him. So you see both sides having dug in with their own position about each other's intentions. And that will be the situation going forward.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much for that. Okay, turning, we've certainly introduced this topic of the relationship between Beijing and Taipei, how complex it is, some of the perspectives on both sides, but let's drill down on that a little further. Under President Xi, as Bonnie referred to earlier, the PRC has accelerated efforts to pressure Taiwan toward unifying with the mainland. We certainly saw some extreme actions out of Beijing when Nancy Pelosi went to visit in 2022, and there have been persistent efforts before and after that time period. Mike, can you tell us a little bit about the history of Beijing's relationship with Taipei and how it has shifted under the Xi administration? Bonnie referred to the 92 consensus, which was sort of an inflection point. Is there more that you can flesh out on that score? And something that you alluded to earlier, that if you could explore a little bit further, is this new normal of increased tension between the two countries, is this dynamic? Is it likely to change, or has it stabilized into a new status quo?
Yeah, I think in general you can describe Beijing's relationship with Taipei as a roller coaster ride, and it depends if you're hurtling down towards instability and tension. It's usually because the Independence Party, DPP, is Progressive Party is in power, and when there is a KMT president, that things tend to stabilize and improve. And Beijing does this by design. Those in Taiwan politics that see a closer relationship with China is the right path ahead, will obviously be well received in China. And you saw this under President Ma's presidency. So from 2008 to 2016, before President Tsai was elected, President Ma was able to have a degree of back and forth with Beijing. There were economic arrangements that were made. There were opening up of links and things like that.
And he was the first DPP president, is that right?
No, we're talking about KMT president.
He was KMT. Okay, so helping our audience understand the Kuomintang.
Right. So this is the Kuomintang, KMT. This is a blue party. And so you did see Beijing trying to work with that leader to be able to incentivize, right, closer integration that Beijing always hopes peacefully will lead to fuller assimilation politically later on. Of course, the challenge is that the one party, one country, two systems sort of approach from the Chinese Communist Party has proven to be sort of a bankrupt formula and not often talked about these days because obviously with the Hong Kong example, the same approach was applied there and China couldn't help itself. And so you found that this 50 years of autonomy that was promised after 1997, the protection of political and economic freedoms were violated by the Chinese. They instigated activities that resulted in the Umbrella Revolution in 2014, and then resumed protests in the late teens. They're all because of Chinese inability to not try to get more, quote, effective control. And so many of the people that left Hong Kong went to Taiwan and told their stories. And the Taiwanese population got to be directly exposed to what it's like when China offers up the one country, two systems formula and see where that path leads. And frankly, it's not what Taiwan is interested in now. So that's sort of a bankrupt policy. That appeared after President Ma, right? This occurred under President Tsai. It's interesting to see how I think Xi Jinping is trying to play the former president, because if you take a look at some of the meetings that were held last month, President Ma, the first Taiwan president ever to go to China, right, was President Ma, and it was last month, former President Ma. And he was courted to a great hall of the people kind of thing, and met with Xi Jinping, and then subsequent to that, President Ma essentially made a public statement encouraging President Lai during his inauguration speech to emphasize kind of this one China principle or approach. And so Beijing has been happy to sort of exploit the differences there between the KMT and the DPP, and we'll see where that goes. I would analyze it this way, that I think that the Chinese are trying to use the carrots and sticks approach. It's kind of fairly obvious that they want to demonstrate the downside of continuing on this path by engaging in these events that are sometimes called gray zone pressure points, right? The Indo-PACOM team calls them multi-domain pressure activities, and they morph and they warp and they show up in different ways, but they're there all the time.
Can you provide an example for us of one of those tactics?
So those things would include patrols that were previously in limited parts of Taiwan are now on the north side, the south side, with a near constant patroller on the east side with a combatant. There have been more and more task groups that have operated east of Taiwan. The Chinese fighters have crossed the median line and now essentially eviscerated what used to be sort of an established protocol for security and to prevent miscalculation, that they would stay on the west side of the median line of Taiwan Strait. They've blown that apart as they've eroded these norms, creating more fear, insecurity, and the potential for miscalculation. There's been a massive amount of air flights in the Taiwan Air Defense Identification Zone, particularly in the southwest, but they also curl around Taiwan and go on the backside with the intent to demonstrate that they can blockade or cut off Taiwan from the world and isolate them and demoralize the Taiwanese population and the political leadership. So this is part of the standard fare of how things have been morphing over time with new tactics that we've seen, including sort of running at the border of the contiguous zone, which goes out 24 nautical miles from the main island of Taiwan, sort of running at that with patrol vessels, and then a number of different new things in the offshore islands. Coast Guard, law enforcement ships, and militia that congregate around Kinmen and Matsu. They'll come in for a short period of time into formally almost sacrosanct sort of restricted zones and then kind of leave, all designed to increase and ratchet up that pressure to try to get a little tighter anaconda-like pressure activity on Taiwan. So while that exists, though, they're trying to show the upside of a relationship through somebody like President Ma, by courting him and showing what it could look like if Taiwan politically would allow for more warming and closer ties. So I think they're playing the carrot and stick game as best as they think that they can, but at the same time, they're creating a great deal of instability in the region because of their activities.
Yeah, most definitely. Quite concerning. Bonnie, can you talk a little bit about the broader political elements of the PRC's pressure campaign, and how has Taiwan responded to the gray zone tactics that Beijing has employed?
Well, I think the first point is that Beijing has a political strategy with a military component towards Taiwan. It is not a military-led strategy. The military component of the strategy has grown. It has become more important. I think it's probably reasonable to say that Beijing realizes that its carrots have not been very effective, but they continue to offer them, and it continues to be part of the strategy. But Beijing has this vast toolkit of political, psychological, economic, informational, diplomatic coercion measures. And they are aimed at making Taiwan's citizens feel isolated and powerless. They are aimed at eroding Taiwan citizens' confidence in their government, in their political system, and in the United States, which is increasingly an important part of that strategy. And the goal is to compel Taipei to engage in political talks with Beijing. So to me, that's very clear what the strategy is. And although sort of multi-domain measures is very useful for the military component of it, I like the term gray zone because it essentially means it's tactics or measures that are taken that stay below the threshold that would trigger involvement by the United States in use of force against China. And so that when the Chinese sent, for example, in February, several Coast Guard ships into the 24 nautical mile contiguous zone around Taiwan, not just Inman, but Taiwan, for the very first time. That is an example of its gray zone. This is not a gray hole, right? And they use their Coast Guard ships, which in many cases look like Navy ships, for that purpose. So just to give a couple of examples, you look at the diplomatic coercion. When Tsai Ing-wen came to power, there were 22 diplomatic allies and countries that recognized Taiwan, and they're now down to 12. I think that's right. Right, the Chinese have poached 10 states. The latest was Nauru. Perfectly timed for after the January 13th Taiwan elections, with Nauru declaring, the day after that it was switching. We increasingly see information manipulation and disinformation. So when Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the Chinese sent this very pointed narrative to Taiwan that the United States did not put troops on the ground in Ukraine, and they are unreliable and will not come to your aid either. And they have been promoting, I would say, really amplifying what is a domestic narrative in Taiwan, so really not initiated by the PRC, but amplified by them, that, the United States switched diplomatic ties in 1979 and really can't be relied upon. Of course, there's so many reasons. There's so many ways we could combat that narrative. We've seen a little bit of economic coercion. They started banning tourists even during, I think, during the end of Ma Ying-jeou's era, which was about the sunflower movement, and the youth did not support the cross-strait trade and services agreement, so Ma had to pull back. And then we even saw undersea cables around Mazu damaged last year by Chinese vessels. I think it's not the first time. Obviously, it's happened many times. That you have 13,000 residents on that small island, and they're completely cut off from the internet. One person was telling me it would take like 5 minutes to send a text, and it took a long time to actually repair. So these are examples of the gray zone taxes that they're using. And just briefly on the response, first of all, under Tsai Ing-wen, there has really been a very robust effort to strengthen ties with democracies. And this is something that William Lai really emphasized in his speech. Even if they are losing the ties with these very small diplomatic partners, they're in the Pacific Islands, they're in Latin America and the Caribbean, and I think one in Africa, Eswatini. And again, only 12. The Vatican remains the sole one in Europe. So that's one thing they're doing. The government and NGOs are working together to combat disinformation in creative ways. That I think in some ways has been effective. They have like fact-checking bots that assist with providing facts. They believe in not pulling down something that might be disinformation because they're very sensitive to the idea that you're limiting freedom of speech. I mean, let's remember, this is a place where I lived there when it was under martial law, which really was lifted in 1987, and I was there in the late 70s. But they're very sensitive to this notion of limiting freedom of speech, so they have to come up with other ways to bring facts to the people. There are U.S. companies that are helping Taiwan to make their undersea cables more resilient, which is terrific that our companies are working with them. But these, particularly in the areas that Mike was talking about, the military, the Coast Guard, the maritime militia, these are very, very difficult to counter. And I think that the U.S. continues to struggle with how to effectively counter it. And the frustration on Taiwan is growing.
Can I add to this? Because one of the most impressive meetings that I had, we were both in Taiwan in mid-March. So we had separate agendas, but we came back and compared notes. But one of the most interesting meetings I had was with the Minister of Digital Affairs. And Audrey Tong is an amazing person. She helped Taiwan be one of the best governments that handled the COVID crisis, and they converted that to say, you would be a great candidate to lead our new ministry, which they established in about a year and a half ago. And they are very focused on the information domain, and we could learn a lot from them. So we heard the minister talk about pre-bunking. In other words, sensing the environment with enough capability to know whether or not misinformation or disinformation, right? Disinformation being more malign, maybe state-directed, and then your disinformation or misinformation being malignant, a bad gouge that happens to get some viral qualities to it. And either one of those, right, not sponsored or sponsored, will affect society. And she told me, because I asked her what was the greatest, threat that she saw in this domain, and she said effective polarization. And I did a double take, and I thought, what do you mean by effective? Is that an E or an A? On effective. And she meant the A, and she was talking about the idea that information divides your society and polarizes it through emotional manipulation. Mm-hmm. And so when she took a look at the danger to Taiwan based on bad information about health issues that could affect people's choices about protecting themselves, right? That's just as important as a national security issue. And so she talked about setting up civic integrity teams that were part of every department. And these are only, maybe a dozen people in one place, 20 in another, but they, in their particular department or agency, will look for and use decision aids, machines helping, look for the growth of things that break a threshold where they might start to qualify as misinformation or disinformation, and then they know to respond to that, and they are authorized to immediately send out like a 200-character response or clarification in that news cycle, like not waiting 2 weeks to get your act together, but instantly correcting it. And because Taiwan has earned so much trust in its institutions, that the people are inclined to put a lot of stock into those releases from the individual departments. They called it instant correction. And so this is an environment where, while they can hold social media companies legally liable for what they actually put on their platforms, a difference, between ourselves and them, but they are wiring themselves to be able to be more resilient in the information domain, and it will stand them in good stead, whether it's an emergency related to a natural disaster or relates to, something that could go terribly wrong there with the Chinese. And so I really admired kind of what their approach looks like today. And I think we ought to send more Americans over there to learn how they do it right.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's great.
If I could just, one more response of by Taiwan to their coercion, which I think is really important. And so I'm going to throw this question to you, Mike. Taiwan has changed its rules of engagement, its military, as a result of some of this ongoing coercion. So maybe you can briefly explain the change in their rules and ROEs, because I think this is really hurting it.
Right. They previously they were focused on a first shot sort of issue where their rules of engagement would start to allow commanders to do different things, and they realized that in the gray zone there's no shot fired, right? But there is a increasing, creeping expansionism and there's threats that keep encroaching. And so they've changed their language to talk about a, quote, first move, right? So if the red side, if the Chinese side has made a first move and a major encroachment, let's say there's a Chinese Coast Guard or a combatant from the People's Liberation Army that approaches beyond the 24 nautical miles, starts coming into the territorial water market, 12 nautical miles. That tactical commander apparently has new authorities to be able to respond as they see fit. Now, they probably would do the blocking maneuvers, which are typical kinds of things. They may do the bridge-to-bridge calls, but there could be warning fires and other choices made by those Taiwan tactical commanders without having to go all the way back up to the president to get approval to take action. So the Taiwan side has had to adjust to the new realities there. And I would say that this all potentially leads to more chances of miscalculation. Not that I won't trust the professionalism on the Taiwan side, but there'd be new dynamics there where some of those commanders could make a false move that could result in something that can spiral out of control. This same is true between the PLA and Taiwan forces, as it could be with the Japanese over the Senkakus. It could be any South China Sea claimant. It could be with the United States side when we operate international waters. So the environment has become way more testy. And these things are really, when you look back at the progenitor of change, it is the Chinese side which is changing the previous norms to something that is creating these anxieties that exist that are forcing nations to try to balance and to adjust to these microaggressions that are being exerted by the PLA side and the Chinese Coast Guard and the militia.
Fascinating. Yeah, we could do hours on this, but we're going to pivot a little bit to how the United States is engaged on this particular topic. So the U.S. and Taiwan have made clear, we have made clear as well as Taipei, that coercion from Beijing to force unification is unacceptable. So Bonnie, starting with you, as we look at what deterrence is available, what deterrent effects are available to the U.S. in combination with Taipei, what tools are available to deter this coercive behavior to force unification? And how effective are those tools likely to be if we, as is, highly possible, that Beijing continues to increase pressure on Taiwan?
Well, I think the most important tools, well, we have a range of tools, but I think one of our most important toolkit is our relations with our allies and partners. And the United States in recent years has made it a priority to maybe use Beijing's term, internationalize the Taiwan Strait, to bring in other countries. For a long time, the U.S.-Taiwan relationship was really the most important in the deterrence equation. And the question is not just who would be there in the fight, because my answer to that, you may or may not agree, Mike, but I think hopefully Japan. I'm not sure there would be any other countries. Maybe we'll be able to operate from the Philippines. I mean, Australia's pretty far away. There's only so much that they can do. But there's also, I think, some caution among many of those countries. For Japan, Taiwan is existential, and we know that. And they are building, as you can explain more eloquently than I can, a lot of capabilities to defend themselves and increasingly to work with us. So that just bringing in other countries, not only in the fight, but in peacetime, to signal that countries have a stake in preservation of peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait. And so we've seen a lot of statements. We have even seen leaders of other countries privately, as I know, communicate to Xi Jinping that there would be serious consequences if he were to use force against Taiwan. I think that matters. We don't know what information is getting up to Xi Jinping, so it's important when a leader has the opportunity to sit with Xi Jinping to convey that message. And there are numerous instances of that. So I think that's one of the things that we have done. We have also tried to make Taiwan more resilient economically. This is partially their own effort to diversify as their companies have begun to diversify. Some have left the PRC and onshored back to Taiwan. Others have set up in Southeast Asia. They still have a lot of investment, a lot of operations, their companies in China. But nonetheless, that is a trend. We are doing more with Taiwan, of course, with the fab that we are opening in Arizona. So we are strengthening Taiwan's role in supply chains, which I think is the right thing to do. There are some people who think the risk of war is so high that we should just pull the supply chains out of Taiwan. I think that's the wrong thing to do. I think we just have to make Taiwan more robust, more resilient. Taiwan needs to, of course, build more capabilities to defend itself, which I'm sure Mike can elaborate on. My bottom line assessment is that the trend is in the right direction, but it's not moving fast enough. There's a lot that they need to do. Just expanding conscription from 4 months to 1 year is a good move, but there's much more that needs to be done to make the reserve force more capable, to have more serious, impactful training for their force, and to create something like a territorial defense force, which exists in places like Finland and Sweden and the Baltics. And we should learn from experience in Ukraine the importance of having civilians play a role in defending the country. And that's an area where Taiwan really lags behind. But the international community can help, and I think is helping. So those are just some of the areas. It's economic, it's diplomatic, it's military, and then, as I said, we have U.S. companies working on making their subsea cables more resilient. So there's a lot of things that I think we can do with Taiwan, but ultimately they need to do more for themselves.
Let me pick up on the thread and describe a few things that they're doing on the military side of it that are strengthening their capabilities. Now, you take a look at the Taiwan defense budget, and it was relatively, flat until 2020, which coincided with a lot of the gray zone, activities in Taiwan and, Hong Kong issues. So Taiwan's defense budget has been creeping up. Almost 2024 budget is estimated to be $19 billion, which is about 2.5% of the GDP of Taiwan, with potentially Lai maybe trying to increase that to 3% of GDP. And so this will be one of these things to watch as defense reforms increase, because when we talk about a stronger, more balanced Taiwan military that isn't so invested solely in big, heavy, slow platforms that are easy to find and easy to kill, what that hybrid force, what that balanced force looks like will require more of the medium to low capabilities there. And the Taiwanese side of it is moving in that direction. I agree with Bonnie that you're going to need more juice, you're going to need more resources to be able to go faster there. But conceptually, we do see very strong moves in this department. And let me detail a few things. For example, when it comes to some of the smaller combatants that have missile packs on them, they have a number of different types which are very mobile. They're very lethal and would be very capable in some of the maneuverings to be able to really harm anything that would try to cross the strait. And And we saw the augmentation of those missile boats with a new corvette, the Taichung corvette, which has even more missiles and more capability, very fast, ship. And not only capabilities there, but they've emphasized more mine laying. They've built a number of mine layers. They have 4 fast mine layers now. They're focused on increasing the mine inventory. They have belts that are be protective around Taiwan. And they're trying to combine these things as well as coastal defense missiles and other surface-to-air missile defenses, strengthen Army, strengthen the Navy in some areas with the submarines that they're building. But I found most intriguing the new concept that they're talking about, which is a littoral strike group or littoral combat command or combat command. I've seen multiple words to describe the same thing, which is a new construct where they'd have essentially a 2-star admiral working for the fleet commander that would be in charge of a collection of these sort of low to medium end, quote unquote, asymmetric capabilities that would be a strong, multi-pronged fighting force that would include the missile boats, it would include mine capability, coastal defense, radar sensing capabilities, and new unmanned systems that they intend to bring into the force. And so when we asked about their unmanned systems, they have a definitive plan to be able to bring multiple types into fruition and really have more of those capabilities to reflect kind of the lessons from the Ukraine war and some other combat environments out there. So they're serious about it. I think they need more and they need to go faster. If they had an increased defense budget, I think they could get there. And the U.S. is assisting where we can because we're obligated under the the Taiwan Relations Act to provide Taiwan with enough defense materials to withstand any kind of pressure to forcefully compel them to unify with Beijing. And if you take a look at, how all this began, if you didn't have such a rapid PLA modernization that was so focused on using these capabilities to resolve the Taiwan situation and deal with potential intervention from the United States, along with the belligerent sort of rhetoric and the words, we kind of debate this about whether or not it's going to be passed on to future generations or not, whether or not that's a serious thing. But the combination of activities that we've seen with Chinese impatience with some of their territorial issues across their entire periphery, but particularly on some of these here that relate to Taiwan, the core sovereignty issue, Taiwan couldn't have sort of stand still and been able to withstand or deter anything. And so this explains why the United States was forced to elevate some of its cooperative support to Taiwan to deal with the manifest threat and the danger presented by the PLA and a political system that wants to resolve the Taiwan issue once and for all.
Just 2 very quick points on the defense spending, which I think is really key. And of course, the one is President Tsai, very supportive from the very top down, the first president of Taiwan to don camouflage, to go out and support the military and talk about the role of the military in defending the country in her speeches. The military has a very negative image in Taiwan. Civil-military relationship is very fraught because of the fact that this was a military that during the authoritarian rule this was a period that was referred to as the White Terror, when many people were wrongly imprisoned for simply speaking their mind. And the military carried out this White Terror. There were people who were killed. They are not trusted. So
when did that period end?
So this essentially ended in the early 1990s. So it even went beyond the end of martial law. And there is a period of healing that needs to take place that has not taken place. So
it was the time period when they transitioned to a democracy.
Yes, that was when they did. So it used to be a party army. It is now a national army. So this is work that needs to be done. But on the defense spending part of it, Tsai, of course, has, again, sent the right signals, but it is based largely on the fact that the pie has grown. The economy has grown tremendously in the 8 years that she has been in power, which has made it easier to spend more. So if they have a growing economy, it will be easier for them to spend more money. The reverse is also true. The second point is just to go back what I said earlier before. Just like our Congress approves defense spending, right? Their legislature does the same. And this will be far more controversial now that the DPP does not have a majority in the legislature. So it will be a fight over how much is spent, how it's allocated, whether or not there are special budgets to perhaps pay for larger weapon systems. And we recently in the United States have provided presidential drawdown authority, foreign military financing to support some of the defense needs of Taiwan, which I think comes at a very important time. But of course, it doesn't replace what they need to do themselves.
I'd also point out that the territorial defense force issue, probably for the reasons you describe, is politically a non-starter. As much as it makes all sense and is a lesson from Ukraine and other countries, it probably won't be something that you'll see anytime soon. They may eventually get there, but not, I don't think, in the near future. But they have established an all-out defense mobilization agency, and that's really an important step. So in addition to some of the defense reforms that are related to conscription expanding from 4 months to 12, and additional monies to the reserve force to try to get better equipment and to do higher quality training for those, focused on maybe the 800,000 of 2 million that more recently released from the reserves. They have those plans. Those are legitimate. There's going to be gradual help there. The All-Out Defense Mobilization Agency is designed to also help with elements that are related to civil defense and kind of coordination mechanisms that allow multiple agencies to work together. And they have a great foundation to make these kinds of things work because they're so good at disaster response and emergency relief because of just the acts of Mother Nature there in that part of the world. So they have a lot to build on, and they talked to me about recruiting 8,000 more first responders. So they're slowly building up more capability and capacity to be able to not only deal with these disasters, but also to deal with a national security emergency where they may need to mobilize more elements of society, be more resilient on the communications side of it. When you think about, moving supplies around, being able to support something that may, in fact, involve combat on the main island of Taiwan. I used to advise Taiwan when I was the Indo-Pacific on J2. I said, you've got maybe a hard shell, but you have a soft center. And so you've got to have strengthened defense in depth in order to increase your deterrence. And so this idea of hardening your inside, in addition to hardening your outside, which is, in fact, a whole of society effort, has begun to get traction in Taiwan. And this feeds into more of a sort of porcupine strategy there that would cause maybe some, second thoughts on the side of Beijing and any temptations they may have to do Taiwan harm. So we'll see how it goes. But I think they have the makings of something that could really strengthen their overall capabilities in a way that could defend against a worst case situation.
Yes, thank you very much. Well, thank you for this wonderful discussion. We've surfaced a lot of issues, and I'm sure provoked a lot of questions among our audience and our listeners online. We have about 20 minutes left in our session today. We're happy to take questions in person, and we have a microphone staged for you. And we're also, we'll be monitoring questions online and happy to receive those as well. AJ.
Yeah. Sir, ma'am, thank you for the exceptional insights today. I really appreciate it. Ma'am, late last year, you wrote an article in Foreign Policy on assurances and deterrence. So for those new to this concept, it sheds a light on both sides of deterrence, one being the threat. If you do not comply, these are the consequences. And the other is the inducement, where if another state does comply, the more favorable outcome. And you advocated for an increased role in assurance with U.S. policy vis-a-vis China. Adapting this to Taiwan, how can Lai Ching-te leverage assurances and strategic messaging to limit escalations with the mainland over his first term?
Thank you for the question. It was published in Foreign Affairs, so we'll give them the credit for being willing to publish a very provocative article by me and my co-authors, Tom Christensen and Jessica Chen-Weiss. I will just, it's a big topic, so I will just say very briefly what we argue in this paper is that deterrence requires credible threats and credible assurances. That credible threats alone are not sufficient. And as we expand the credibility of our threats, which we are doing and need to do, there also needs to be some credibility in our assurances. So if China attacks Taiwan, we have to have very clearly, if you plan to do that, these are going to be the consequences, and they are unacceptable, and you will not be able to tolerate them. I think the message to Beijing should be clearly, it will set back your ability to achieve national rejuvenation, because I believe this is really Xi Jinping's top priority. And the assurance is, then if you don't use force against Taiwan, which would also be if you back off from some of these other sort of gray zone threats, you accept this status quo at some level. Your worst nightmares are not going to become real anyway, right? That you will. We, the United States, will not support an independent Taiwan. We will not restore our diplomatic relationship with Taiwan. We will not revive our mutual defense treaty. In my view, that is really sort of the core of what the Chinese fear. Other kinds of assurances, it's not, we will not sell arms to Taiwan. That is not part of the argument. So I think there's been a lot of misunderstanding about it. I think what Lai can and should do is to make clear that he, which he has already done, at least in sort of rhetoric, that he sees Taiwan already as an independent sovereign country, but he will not do anything to pursue legal independence. That has been the position of prior Taiwan leaders. Every president since Lee Teng-hui has said Taiwan is an independent sovereign state. It is actually interesting, though, that he said, he referred to Taiwan being an independent sovereign state in his inaugural address, which is the first time it's been said in an inaugural address, but not the first time it's been said. He did say he would preserve the status quo, all three sides of different interpretations of the status quo, but we understand what Taiwan's definition is. And so the only thing he needs to do, in my view, is he's made these statements, he needs to be consistent, and he needs to pursue actions in accordance with them. So the worst thing that any national leader can do is have one set of rhetoric, messages that they give, and have their actions not match with those messages. I think there are times that many countries do that, including us, which I think then confuses your target. So you really want to be consistent. And so I think that's the opportunity that he faces, that as he assumes the presidency, that he can pursue these policies that will convey to the PRC that he has no intention of pursuing independence. We've only had one president in Taiwan that has taken an action which I think the United States would see as pushing for independence. That was Chen Shui-bian and this was in the end of the first decade of the 2000s. And he pushed to hold a referendum that would allow Taiwan to join the United Nations under the name Taiwan. And that George W. Bush sat alongside China's premier at the time, Wen Jiabao, and said, that guy in Taiwan who's a troublemaker, that is the worst possible outcome for our friends in Taiwan. I do think they learned a lesson from that. But now it would be even more dangerous to pursue a course like that. So I would not suggest that I have seen anything that William Lai has said or done that would suggest that he would do that. So I think that's what he needs to do. He needs to have himself create more credible threats, but also to provide some credible assurances.
Small editorial. I think, and I've seen this in the Department of Defense and beyond, that we've gotten really liquored up on, the phrase integrated deterrence. And almost, it takes all the oxygen out of the room when it comes to where should the U.S., spend its energies to be able to shape kind of the environment the way that we'd like to see it. What doesn't get enough play is integrated assurance, or I even talk about integrated shaping to say, hey, you will never stop some enemies from doing certain kinds of things. What is the object of your deterrence in the beginning? Can we just clarify that? And I think that we have gotten really obsessed with trying to stop one event rather than trying to take a look at how do we actually raise up and look at the macro strategic dynamics and use all the tools that we have as a nation, all the instruments available to us to really affect the outcome that we think is better for stability, for prosperity, for security for all. And I think integrated deterrence, because it's become so dominant, has essentially unintentionally minimized the kinds of things that Bonnie's talking about, which are just as important as strength.
Mm-hmm. And supported by classic deterrence theory, that you need to have both assurances and deterrent effect.
Right. Quick follow-up question. I'm Ligario Tivier. I cover China and Taiwan in Senate Intelligence Committee. To your argument on your provocative article, perhaps a provocative question, you're right. There have been a lot of discussions and misunderstandings after your article, so I would like you to explain do you think China will be deterred by our credible assurance if Xi Jinping decides PLA is ready, U.S. is at a vulnerable point, world is in chaos, this is a good time to invade? Like, if she makes that decision, do you think he would be credibly assured? Like, do you think it would work for us to provide credible assurance for him to be deterred? Thank you.
I think it's one piece of the equation. All of the other factors that you mentioned certainly matter, but they're not going to embolden him in my view, nor will they deter him. If the United States, we were supposed to get into this, so I will raise it here as an example, and Mike knows what I'm talking about. Another hotly debated issue is whether the United States should give Taiwan an ironclad commitment to its defense. Say strategic clarity, right? I don't think that's going to deter China, right? So all of these other factors do matter. It's what's happening in the international environment. It's Xi Jinping's assessment of U.S. willingness to defend Taiwan, capability to defend Taiwan, and Taiwan's will and capability to defend itself. I don't think we are at that point. And something that Mike and I probably we disagreed about is how urgent is Xi Jinping to achieve this unification. In my view, it is not at any cost. It is something he wants to do, if it is something that he can do at a tolerable cost. And my former colleague, Kat Hicks, our Deputy Secretary of Defense, is fond of saying, I don't know whether she got it from me, so I won't take credit, but I've been saying it for years. We want Xi Jinping to get up every day and say, today is not the day. But the factors that you mentioned certainly matter. I just do not believe that Xi Jinping is looking for a war with the United States. If he believes he can take Taiwan and they will surrender and he doesn't have to pay a cost, then he may move. But the potential for a long drawn-out war in Taiwan, a defeat at the hands of Taiwan and the United States that would call into question the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party, these are also factors that I think will deter Xi Jinping. So it's a complex equation as to what will contribute to deterrence. But at this moment, if we were to establish diplomatic ties with Taiwan, which, by the way, I don't think whoever is our next president is going to do, I think it's highly unlikely. But I do believe that we could end up provoking the attack that we seek to deter. So I think we have to have a deeper understanding, hard to get into Xi Jinping's mind, but what deters, what will deter him, and what will provoke him.
I think we do have to engage in sort of the positive elements of what does it mean for, how does China benefit from maintaining the status quo? I think that we're prone to be disbelieved with everything we say. If we try to assure we're the hegemon, we're the ba, we engage in deception, we're the black hand, we're not to be believed by any respect, right? And so this is a very difficult thing. You can't measure how much assurance, but this idea that are you aiming at regime change? This is a central, concern, a paranoia for maybe some justified reasons, because I think most Americans probably take a look at the CCP and say, you know what, there's a century of humiliation, but then the CCP oversaw 30 years of self-humiliation in China with a great leap forward, the Cultural Revolution, pours dirt through the 70s, all brought to you by the CCP, and maybe there's a different way. So I think, though, that China is pretty locked in with the CCP. The CCP has lethal instruments. You're going to have to deal with the CCP, but they fundamentally don't trust, what we say, our policies, or anything. I think there are limits to it, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't be engaging in it in order to just kind of shape the environment to the best possible way you can. And, you may get to a point when we talk about war of necessity or a war of choice, right? The war of necessity would be there's some red line that's crossed and China has to move maybe before it feels it's fully prepared to do so, but has to because they cannot ignore, such a move that's been, made. At the same time, the war of choice seems to be moving, forward in a way under Xi Jinping where he aims to resolve this once and for all. And I agree with Bonnie that he wouldn't do it at any or all costs, right? That there's still the potential to invest in deterrence and to have good effects from that deterrence. That involves a lot of different things that we are still doing, and it's questionable how much we should be doing and what more we need to do to be able to maintain and sustain deterrence over time. But I really worry that that the Chinese power is growing and the impatience under Xi Jinping that he's committed so much to resolving his own personal reputation, his legacy and so the question of whether or not this could go down in the next 10 years, I think this is why the title is the decisive, decade, because these choices we make now along this path will determine whether or not Beijing and Xi Jinping actual is tempted to go, because he somehow has convinced himself that he's got the correlation of forces in the geopolitical environment and everything else there that makes it the most ripe decision to move, whether it's the late 2030 or late 2020s or early 2030s, and then goes ahead and does that because he thinks that he can get a quick win, right, and then face something that's akin to the Tiananmen response, where the international community said a lot of naughty words back to Beijing. You had some sanctions for a time, but because the Chinese economy was so strong, the world needed to come back to China. So in his mind, he has historical examples of how China has gotten away with egregious behavior before. And this is the reason why we're concerned, because the temptations may be growing under certain conditions. We need to understand all of those conditions and try to work those variables in the best possible way so that glance at the Western Pacific suggests to Xi Jinping that today is not the day for every day, multiple years going.
Thank you for that. I'm going to turn to our online listeners and see if we have questions there. Asha?
Yes, we do. We actually have several. I'm picking out some of the more interesting ones since we are short on time. Particularly one from Kevin. I think it's really interesting because we're coming up the heels of the China-Russia, meeting. We saw the two presidents hug. We saw them not wear a tie. A lot of strategic signaling. So Kevin asks online, can you comment on the growing relationship between Beijing and Moscow and how the U.S. sees that affecting the Taiwan question? So I think anyone can answer this. Maybe Mike can jump in with the red side, and Bonnie can jump in.
So obviously there's greater collaboration that's occurring. You guys have heard the new term CRINC, sort of this condominium or loose block of China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea, the sort of axis of autocracies, people have called it that. And so, it's not an alliance system the way that we would talk about NATO, and it will probably never, ever go there. But you can see the sort of anti-Western approach, the idea to reshape the world and to satisfy each of those countries' desires to have spheres of influence and a greater say in a number of different issues. That this is a block of powers now you can't just ignore. You can't just put China as the top in our national strategic sort of strategies without thinking through what is this new trend of the close relationships and how they'll mutually support one another across all of the economic, military, dimensions and beyond. So this is going to have to be, I think, addressed by the next security strategy. What are the implications when you have the support that shows up in covert ways and then more overt ways? So you have the no limits sort of discussion there, and you could argue that Russia's been able to sustain itself and bounce back because and only because of China's support for Russia in its aggression against Ukraine, right? And so you can expect that there'll be Russian support of unknown, quantities of unknown types for China if there's a Taiwan fight, right? That will be an exchange in kind sort of relationship. I don't think it's been defined, but I think the pressure will be strong on Russia to help China back the way that China's helping Russia today.
Thank you.
Take another question.
Yeah, one more. I apologize. I think we're going to need to, one more online, one more in the room, and then we'll need to close this session out. This has been such a fascinating opportunity. In the room, I know you're holding the mic now.
Yeah, sure. So we've had a great discussion about the nature of the gray zone conflict and China's largely untested military capabilities. I was wondering if you could spend a little more time on kind of phase zero of what would be an invasion or a blockade, which is going to China's cyber capabilities, which they are tested in our near-peer adversary, and also related strikes against satellites. We mentioned a little bit undersea cables, and what that would do to Taiwan. Like what are China's capabilities in kind of knocking out Taiwan digitally and otherwise, and then how that would shape the battlefield, and then finally what Taiwan's current readiness is, what it needs to do alongside allies like the United States to, bolster its defenses to, dissuade a sort of attack from China.
So I'll take that. So we're in phase zero already. You can say we're in maybe, an advanced stage of phase zero. There's a lot of activity going on, maybe parts of phase one in the old way that we described this. Taiwan's very much aware of these threats that could be remote ones. In fact, take a look at all of the red courses of action, and it could be simply plinking from, missile systems and cyber capabilities and sanctions, without anything else surrounding Taiwan to increase the pain points and try to compel a political outcome there. And so there are options. Taiwan knows this, and like I described before, the Ministry of Digital Affairs is working cloud services to have, Taiwan's data to be still available and not destroyed on servers only in Taiwan, for example. they've taken a page with regard to the need for direct satellite downlinks, from low Earth orbiting proliferated satellite systems, and are contracting with a number of vendors from Europe to do that. It would have been Starlink as a choice, but you have Elon Musk completely co-opted by the Chinese there and unwilling to support Taiwan, as there's null zone around Taiwan with Starlink because of his choice. But there are other providers, and Taiwan is getting those. So you can imagine that Taiwan is thinking through all these courses of action. And ultimately, when you take a look at history, when a population is, bombed repeatedly, whatever, that only strengthens most populations there. So I'm not sure that will actually do the job. And this is the reason everybody tends to come back to the more intensified campaigns, whether or not they're a blockade or an invasion, to be able to really get to some form of an attempted capitulation.
Thank you. One last question online.
Yes. So, of course, there's lots of questions about the invasion or the likelihood of invasion, but I think we can maybe summarize this as, this is a good question, I think. Is it conceivable that China could take Taiwan peacefully through misinformation campaigns, etc.? So I think, Bonnie, if you could talk a little bit about that and how you view that type of potential manipulation affecting the Taiwanese population, things of that nature.
I think this is a really great question that deserves more attention and more research. There's actually a new report that a colleague at the American Enterprise Institute just released on this, and I haven't had the chance to read it, so I won't comment on it, but I did see the headline and just read the executive summary. And I'm glad that people are doing research on it. We shouldn't just dismiss out of hand the ability of Beijing to succeed in this persistent effort to use this ever-expanding toolkit of coercive measures against Taiwan. Although the trend today is toward, I would say, in some ways, a less isolated Taiwan. If you use other measures, it's a more isolated Taiwan. And as I noted, ever since 1979, there have been doubts in Taiwan about the reliability of the United States. They're about, usually public opinion polls would show, about 30% of the people who just say they're not sure if the United States will come to Taiwan's defense, whether we will put at risk our blood and treasure to defend Taiwan. And the Chinese, I think, often say, I've heard experts say this, Taiwan's more important to them than it is to us. And I don't think that's true. I think we have to make sure that they understand that. But if you look at just some of the views of people in Taiwan who they don't want to go to war, this is understandable. They have lived for now, 70 years in peacetime. The threat has always been across the strait. It has not been a serious threat of invasion that it is today, but there's always been a threat. And it's taken a while, I think, for people to take more seriously. The Ukraine invasion really helped. But, I think that there is this potential for people in Taiwan to say, well, the trend's not in the right direction. If we're going to preserve what we have, then maybe we should engage in negotiation with Beijing. Some will say Hong Kong certainly proved that Beijing will never give Taiwan a better deal, but there will be concern. And if a leader in Taiwan were to pursue some provocative action, one could imagine a scenario in which people in Taiwan say, wait a minute, we're not going along with that, which would cause even greater polarization, I think, in the society, because some would say, now's the time, we want independence. But I just think that there is this potential out there, as I said, that people don't take seriously enough, that China's constant messaging, and particularly if China were to become somewhat less authoritarian That doesn't mean, I'm not saying become a democracy, because I don't think that's in the cards. But if you had a different leader, different policy toward Taiwan, if there was a sense that the United States is pulling out of the region, is not going to defend Taiwan, I think that there are certain circumstances in which people in Taiwan would say, well, maybe now is the time. And we should not forget that, as you mentioned, Ma Ying-jeou earlier, that when he campaigned to become president and when he was first inaugurated, he said that his goal was to have political talks with China, which meant reaching some kind of a settlement. That was not that long ago. The international situation has changed dramatically, and the relationship between China and Taiwan has changed dramatically. We shouldn't rule out the possibility that one could return to that situation if there were a different kind of leader in Taiwan. So it is an important question.
Well, thank you very much, Bonnie and Mike. We really appreciate your insights today. I think our decision makers in Washington have great resources to turn to in trying to shape our policy in a way that redounds to U.S. interests in this really complicated space. Thank you to the partnership of the German Marshall Fund who helped us arrange this today, and certainly to the Center for Strategic Competition for all their hard work for putting on this talk today.
Thank you, Margaret.
Thank you, Rob.